Okay, we have people coming in. Just gotta look at everything here. Turn on the captions as well. Hello everyone. Very good to see everyone coming in. We haven't had a virtual event in a little while, so I hope you missed us. Um, and yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. And anyone who comes in a little late, hopefully they won't miss very much. Hello, I'm Omar Acevedo. I'm the literary program coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for the Improbable Victoria Woodhull, Suffrage, Free Love, and the First Woman to Run for President. Now, virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are grateful to honor his memory with these programs. And I want to say a quick thank you to our members. I know there are quite a few of you here. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member by visiting our website. And now on to our guests. Eden Collinsworth is an author, former media executive, and business consultant. She was a president of Arbor House Publishing Company and founder of the Los Angeles-based monthly lifestyle magazine Buzz, before becoming a vice president at Hearst Corporation. And Erin Bartram is the Associate Director of Education at the Mark Twain House and Museum. She earned a PhD in 2015 from the University of Connecticut, where she studied 19th century United States history with a focus on women, religion, and ideas. Now, during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat, but if you have a specific question, please post that directly into the Q&A section. At the bottom of the screen, there is a box with a question mark and it says Q&A, so just put your question in there so it doesn't get lost in the chat. So that's all from me. I might be back later on, but I will now turn this over to Eden and Erin.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Eden, for joining me tonight, and thank you to everybody in the chat and joining tonight. I know that there was a lot of interest in this, and it's deserved because this is an incredible person. So I know some of you may be familiar with Victoria Woodhull from a bunch of different angles. I think tonight we're going to talk about some of those and then talk about some things that may be unfamiliar to you. There's many lives lived in this one life. So I want to start out, Eden, just by asking you kind of how did you come to investigate her and decide that she was sort of worth your attention and worth another look?
Well, that in and of itself is an amusing story. I am currently based in London, although I'm speaking to you from New York. And during COVID lockdown, it's unfair to compare lockdowns in various locations, but in London it was really very severe, and so one could only be outside for an hour at a time, and it was heavily patrolled, actually. So that went on for at least 4 or 5 months, and then there was this kind of interim period where the virus abated. And it happened that I've always been very supportive of the British Museum in London, and the museum was closed for the better part of that year. But knowing that I was an author, and knowing also that I might be interested in understanding what was originally the British Museum I'm sorry, the British Library within the British Museum before the books were moved. The librarian was kind of recataloging everything, and there were very few books, but there were objects. And so I was invited to come in, and I was masked, and the librarian was masked, and she had been there during the course of the lockdown working on this project. So she was very intense about it, understandably so. But I looked around, and there were no books, and there were very few objects. There was, to my right was the shell of an incendiary bomb that had come through the ceiling during the Blitz. And then there were postcards from Karl Marx and so on and so forth. But on one of the shelves, I noticed in this beautiful kind of blue vellum leather, these, I would call them folios. And on the spine was Woodhull versus the British Museum. And so I asked, well, what is this? Who is that? And she was quite fierce when she turned to me and pulled down her mask and said, well, that was another American woman who was very, who caused a great deal of problems here. But she didn't specify what problems, this woman had caused. And that's what prompted me to look into who Victoria Woodhull was. And
Mhm.
indeed, she did cause a great deal of problems with the British Museum because she showed up, when she settled in London, hoping that they had archived very positive articles about her. And what she found instead were rather unflattering articles that had run in America. And so she sued the museum and the trustees and the head librarian for libel. So, here's this woman who kind of came at this very august institution like a bat out of hell. Nobody knew who she was. And to her credit, she defended herself against actually the attorney general, who was himself a trustee of the museum. But he was renowned for his cross-examination, and there she was, a woman of a certain age who had no formal education, and she won the libel case. So that's a rather long answer, but
Yeah.
there you have it.
Yeah, and that's sort of where we start the book with this case,
Mhm.
and then travel back through this fascinating life of invention and reinvention. We were chatting before we started, and I was remarking that it seemed to me the kind of story. I have a friend who often wonders, when was the last moment in America where you could disappear?
Mhm.
And to me, this really felt like a story that could only happen when you had, mass communication like newspapers and pamphlets and mass transit in some sense, but none
Mhm.
of that being quick enough to catch up with her every time she reinvented herself. So can you just take
Yes.
us through some of the lives she had, both the ones that people
Uh,
might know and
yes.
and the ones people probably don't know?
Yes. Well, I think it's important to frame it in the perspective of where she came from
Hmm.
and what her home life was. So
Yeah.
she was born, as you say, in 1838 in the most remote, it wasn't even really a frontier town. It was kind of an outpost. And, there were a couple of buildings and one store that also acted as the post office, and one road going through it. And the parents were, I mean, you couldn't make them up in fiction either. So the father, his name was Buck, and he was a con man. And was always one step ahead of being run out of town or frankly, tarred and feathered.
Hmm.
And the mother was a religious zealot who was illiterate and, kind of dangerously mentally ill. And the children, there were seven children, nine originally, and two had died in infancy. And Victoria, was not educated. There were no books. But she, at a very, very early age, I think it was 4 or 5, it was very clear that she was incredibly precocious. And so she insisted that she taught herself to read. And again, no books, no reference points. But she insisted that she was visited by a spirit guide at that young age. And she described him very vividly, that this was a kind of a Greek philosopher. He was in, white robes. And he told her that that she would become very wealthy in a city on water surrounded by ships. And then eventually she would be a leader of people. And so her father, quite honestly, whether or not this was an escape from her hideous childhood or whether she, in fact, did fall into a trance, it's impossible to know, obviously. But the father saw a way of making money out of it. And so he advertised her as a child clairvoyant. And again, to frame this in a time perspective, this was after the Civil War when there were so many people who were killed either on the battlefield or died with disease. It was impossible to know whether people were, that these men and boys were coming back. There was no, if they didn't come back, it often was the case, it was impossible to identify their remains. And so, they were these kind of mass, graves that were unmarked. And the more institutional religions were not helpful, I mean, to say the least. And so what kind of coalesced in America was spiritualism. And it wasn't so much a religion as it was a kind of I would say a cultural shift, a sociocultural shift. And on the East Coast, there were, it was intellectually driven. There was Thoreau and, Walt Whitman. And in these small Midwestern towns, there was money to be made by insisting that a clairvoyant could reach the dead. And keep in mind, this was a period where electricity had been invented, that the telegraph had been invented. So people believed that, well, if you could communicate through the air, messages, then a clairvoyant could speak to the dead, but in a very life-affirming way, that the dead would speak back. And so it turned out that Victoria, at the age of 6 and 7, ended up supporting this family as they moved from small Midwestern town to small West, but and they were fundamentally charging a fee for, on her behalf to speak to the dead. And they were also selling elixir from the back of the wagon. And this, by the way, was just kind of a combination of vegetable oil and probably, liquor and amphetamine. So, who wouldn't feel better, right? If you had that. And that also, when I researched that kind of trend where they were literally, understandably referred to as snake oil salesmen, what it became very apparent that in these very kind of profound, drastic shifts in a culture, in America specifically, what kind of bubbled up to the surface were these con men, and to take full advantage of of a public that didn't really know how to think of these changes. And so it was interesting for me to learn, for example, that the original Rockefeller was selling elixirs from the back of his wagon. And he actually was quite clever about it all, because he started on the East Coast. He moved from East Coast to West Coast selling elixirs, and he would scout out farmers who couldn't afford, they needed a loan, and there was a shortage of funds, and he would give them what he made from the elixirs with the understanding it was a loan with interest. And then when he came back from West to East Coast, inevitably they couldn't pay him, and he appropriated the land, a great deal of which was sitting on oil. So, it's an interesting reminder of this period, where there was so much change. There came a point where, at the age of 14, Victoria was ready to escape her incredibly, abusive parents, but especially the father, who was obviously exploiting her. And so she decided to marry a man twice her age, who in Ohio, who was on his way to Chicago. And she was convinced that Chicago was a city on water surrounded with ships. She decided money could be made there, and she would become wealthy there. And she arrived there only to realize that this man, at that point was an addict and a kind of ne'er-do-well. And she had a son by him, who was very disabled, and mentally and physically. And she, again, keep in mind, this was a period where women had no legal rights. whatever money they might be earning or they came, to the marriage was appropriated by the husband. And there was no legal recourse, and the husbands were allowed to beat their wives as long as it wasn't, with a stick or something. I mean, there was literally the reference to the fact that it couldn't be any wider than a little finger. So you could beat your wife with, any kind of instrument as long as he didn't pummel her to death. And so she realized at that point that in order to take charge of her life, she had to take charge of her husband's life, and knowing that she would have to continue to take care constantly of this infant boy. And she decided that they all should cross the country. And, this is in a wagon when things were so dangerous. She wanted to get to San Francisco during the gold rush. That was a city on the water, surrounded by ships. She thought that this could be, where the wealth comes from. And she arrived there only to find that it was kind of a shanty town, and none of the miners were interested in, clairvoyancy, but they might have, there were 40 men to every woman. And so, to be completely blunt about it, I suspect that she supported herself and her family, as a prostitute for that year. Um, and there came a point where she insisted that she had another visitation from her spirit guide, who urged her to return to the East Coast. She did so, and the spirit guide then suggested, in no uncertain terms, that she move to New York, and she did that. And there she crossed paths, or perhaps deliberately stalked, it's hard to know, which the richest man in America, Cornelia Vanderbilt. And that
Well,
yet
this
another
is
lie.
where things get fascinating because number one, the most improbable thing in this entire book is that you
Mhm.
would have a dream of a specific address in
Yes,
Manhattan and
yes.
move there and live there. Like
I know.
unfathomable today.
I know.
But this passage, this section actually was one of the most fascinating to me because I think a lot of people who have heard of her and
Mhm.
thinking about, what's in the title of the book, part of that is what's like free love, it's always going to be in the title. We
Yes.
know her because of her advocacy of free love. We know her as a suffragist. We know
Mhm.
her as a candidate for presidency. But I wonder if you can talk about the brokerage firm that she
Yeah,
founds
yeah.
and how thinking about her, what her sister, what they both do together might urge people to think differently about the history of finance in the US and women's
Yeah,
place in
yeah.
it.
Yes. Well, so upon having another visitation, she was very proactive and
Yes.
she packed her bags and brought her younger sister. You're right,
Yeah.
by the name her she was quite young at the time. I don't think she was, had broken into her 20s. Her name was Tenny, short for Tennyson. She was completely beguiling, by the way, and rather, carefree and kind of, I wouldn't call her, I mean, she was also another loose cannon, but in a different way.
Hmm.
And she really enjoyed, the fun that could be found in male company. And so, whether or not, I mean, Cornelia Vanderbilt was a spiritualist. So, whether or not she was aware of that and sought him out and used that as kind of leverage, it's difficult to know, but she had a kind of two-prong approach to establishing a working relationship with him. She insisted and convinced him that she could help him, with other visitations from, as in her role as clairvoyant, with deceased investors on stock tips, which is really kind of goofy, but but he didn't have a problem with that. And then at the same time, her younger sister became his mistress. And this is a man in his 70s, so there was a huge age gap.
Mhm.
And immediately the financial tide turned, and all of a sudden there was a lovely carriage with two white horses and so on and so forth. But along the way, and you're right, this is really where it gets interesting. Victoria was very attentive to what transpired in terms of selling and buying stock.
Mhm.
And so she just was a sponge picking all of this up. Women had no right to be, they were not allowed to trade in stock.
Mhm.
But what she did was completely brilliant and hugely astute in that there was 24 hours, and it was called the Black Friday, when gold plummeted and took with it the stock market, because stock was kind of holding together as currency the value of the entire economic picture, so to speak,
Mhm.
in terms of investment. And she understood that that eventually the market would correct itself and the value of these stocks would rebound. And so she couldn't obviously buy stock on her own. So as she always did, she used kind of men as proxies, and she sent them into the trading room, and they bought, at the lowest possible, bottom of the barrel level. And she was right, of course. 3 months later, the market found its legs again, and she became independently wealthy on her own. And, with anybody else, myself included, frankly, I mean, that would have been that. I would have taken the money, and who among us wouldn't have, just looked, forward
Cashed
to a
in and
life
gone
of
home.
pleasure? That was not the case with her. She decided to take the money and do something even more, frankly, outlandish for a woman, and start her own brokerage house. And again, women could not, buy stock. I mean, the premise of it was nonsensical. And she became obviously immediately known, and rather notorious. But she did extremely well. And what she did was she depended upon the information that was received by the high class madams of the very expensive brothels. And keep in mind, this is the Gilded Age in New York, and businessmen and bankers would frequent these very kind of upscale brothels, and the so-called working girls would hear the chit chat, and they would report it to the madam, and the madam would report it to Victoria. And so there was this kind of wonderful kind of circular irony where she couldn't buy stock, but in fact she made money, with the information from women who were fundamentally selling sex that came back to her. And she would send, men in to buy the stock for her, and so her brokerage firm did extremely well, extremely well.
Yeah,
And she,
I think some of this will be very familiar. I know some of our staff members who portray the domestic staff of the house are watching tonight, and this idea of the information economy among particularly women as a source of power,
yeah,
she seemed to take this to, you know, essentially
she,
daring someone.
yeah, no, she monetized it.
Yeah.
That was it. That was all she had. And
Hmm.
she outwitted a system that disallowed her to actually act on it. But then, what happened at that point? I mean, this is where I think her spirit guide should have reappeared at some point, and just warned her that hubris usually, what is the expression, pride goeth before the fall, because she had become wealthy in New York on her own, a city on the water surrounded with ships. And at that point, she decided, well, she's going to zero in on the third, promise, so to speak, but of becoming a leader among, people, a leader of people, I should say. And so she decided, in order to cast a wider net. I mean, she was quite well known at that point
Hmm.
for opening up this brokerage house. And Susan Anthony visited her, and Walt Whitman came to visit her, and she was, she was kind of maligned. There were any number of articles that kind of sexualized her, her intelligence and, astute trading in the market. But she wanted more than anything to reach out to a broader audience, so to speak. And whether or not it was because she had become enamored by her own celebrity, I don't know. It's difficult to know. I don't mean to be so harsh on her, but I think that there was something about that at that juncture, she moved into something hugely ambitious. And it's difficult to know. I'm not suggesting she wasn't a feminist, but she was also a sexual opportunist. And so it's difficult to know what, egg, chicken, egg, what came first. But she fundamentally, in order to put her political platform across to the public, she then launched a newspaper, a weekly newspaper. And so that was yet another vehicle for her outreach. And it was really the platform for her to convey her political agenda. And it was, she, as always, she had an orbit of very capable men who would kind of curate, these editorials and possibly even ghost write some of her own, but they were her ideas, and they were remarkable given the time. So she proposed an 8-hour workday. She was the first to run an English translation of the Karl Marx's manifesto in her newspaper. And by the way, the manifesto was researched and written in the
Yeah.
museum, right? The British Museum. And she proposed national health care. She proposed, and this is so kind of, I mean, this is what stunned me. She proposed an international court of arbitration. So if there were trade issues, it could be grappled with in a way that was, that with transparency. But I mean, that was that was so sophisticated, frankly. I don't mean to sound condescending, but I mean, you're talking about the 19th century when, at any rate, she then she began to work with the suffragette movement, in the suffragette. The old guard was kind of suspicious of her because she was, she was lived a louche, according to them, it was not really the way to behave. And they never really trusted her. And they were anxious that there was too much self-promotion involved. Um, but nonetheless, it was clear that she was in a position actually to capture, at least, to convey, the idea of that women's right to vote to a congressional committee, and that she did. And of course, it took what 50 more years for the women to finally get the right to vote. But she then generated even more publicity as a result. And that is where she caught the attention of Anthony Comstock, who really was her undoing for a period of time because he had woven himself into the postal service. This was somebody who, believed that he was called on to by God to kind of clean up first New York City and then, the entire state, from state to state, anything that he considered pornographic or provocative. He had the support of, the church, the very strident church leaders. And he managed to, by offering not to accept a salary, he managed to somehow implant himself into the postal service on a federal level. So he was very clever, actually, strategic, in that he established a situation where somebody in one state ordered a copy of the newspaper. It crossed state lines. That enabled him to arrest and incarcerate Victoria for distributing pornography. And she ended up in jail for a period of time. So that was the point at which she arrived at her very low ebb, because when she got out, she had lost her brokerage house, understandably, and she had to, shutter her newspaper. But that
Yeah.
was not the end of her story.
No, and I'm glad you sort of started this with a thing that I had noted, a theme that you kind of come back to, and I wanted to sort of push a little on this dichotomy of is she self-serving or a feminist, and sort of ask another question I had sort of would these manipulations that all this manipulative behavior and all this stuff would it have been necessary if she were a man? Probably not. And was there a way was there a way for her to be a feminist without being self-serving, or would asking her to be a feminist without being self-serving be sort of the further elevation? I note that, the one of the things that sort of puts her in the bad books for a lot of suffragists is her sort of advocacy of free love. And
Yes.
what I note is really interesting is that the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls actually calls out the sexual double standard pretty explicitly, but it
Yes.
casts it as men can do what they want, and when women do the same thing, they're castigated.
Yes.
And there's one interpretation of that, which is men should also not behave this way,
Yeah.
whereas Victoria says maybe we should all sort of do
Yes.
this.
Yes.
But
Well,
this,
yeah, no,
you know,
I agree. I agree. So free love, was not defined in a way we
yeah.
would assume. It's not, the call for sexual promiscuity.
Hmm.
It was more a social conceit, so to speak.
Hmm.
And there were communes, but but it in the Northeast states especially, but it fundamentally had to do with the right of women to divorce men if they were abused, for women to be in a position to earn a living if they then got divorced, for women to have the opportunity to enjoy a sexual relationship of their choosing. It wasn't a call, for
Hmm.
women to become debauched, but it did. It also, at the risk of of becoming rather graphic, it also it encouraged men to understand that women can enjoy sex, and
Hmm.
so in that way, it was provocative,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
so, and there was no, keep in mind, they were other than the withdrawal method, there really wasn't a way of, there weren't, there was no family planning, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, and so, it was, at the time, it actually, there was nothing about it that was illogical, by the way. But it was cast in a certain light, most especially by the old guard of the suffragette movement, which, just decided that she was too much. She was just too much of everything. And she was young and she was guileless and she was without apology. And I think that's why I wouldn't call it hubris, but she was at times her own worst enemy, I think. And that would not disqualify her from being a feminist, I don't think.
And
Um,
you actually, in describing her, make a really excellent case for why free love as this larger ideological package is important, because as she's doing all of these extremely normal things for men, like being in public and running a brokerage house and all this kind of stuff, her choice to be in public in any way,
mhm,
and Catherine Beecher is notorious for doing this. People like the idea of a woman being in public
mhm.
is is immediately sexualized.
Yes,
And our old friend Benjamin Butler, who's in this book,
yes,
has
yes.
his own problems with that. And it kind of led me to something we were talking about before. As someone whose background is in women's history, there was a piece written maybe 15 years ago by Alice Kessler Harris, a really important women's historian, who basically asked, like, has doing all of this women's history, has it changed what we think American history was?
Mhm,
And I work in a museum where the idea that Mark Twain is the American, which he didn't really say, but whatever, like, everyone knows his is an American story. And scholars of women and Americans who aren't white, and basically anyone in any marginalized position, have really struggled to make a claim that these stories are
Mhm.
universal. I'm supposed to see Mark Twain as a universal American.
Mhm.
How would you make the argument that Woodhull is somebody we can look at and say that is an American story?
Well, she had qualities that were decidedly American. And,
Mhm.
I mean, I deliberately positioned her, early in the book as somebody who shows up and confronts, in a very American way, very direct way, the kind of quintessential English, upper class, highly educated men. And and remained completely logical about her case. It was the same with how she handled the issue of the women's right to vote in front of obviously an exclusively male congressional committee, when she pointed out that she paid taxes, a great deal of taxes. She didn't break any laws. She created jobs. She was literate. She could not vote. So, it's very difficult to argue why not? Why would that not be? But, with everything, she was just forward thinking. And,
Mhm.
I've lived in many countries, during the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And I have seen what, you know, America looks like, to foreigners. And, they can be charmed by the directness, but then they can also be kind of appalled by it, frankly.
Mhm.
Frankly. And I could see how, I mean, Mark Twain was beguiling. He was, he was charming. He was witty. He also, I was a former book publisher, as you've mentioned, and I so admire the fact that um, he dealt with, copyright issues. He published himself. I mean, he wasn't particularly successful. He was hugely successful with his books. I mean, the Innocents Abroad that
Mhm.
sold over 100,000 copies, and what happened was the more successful he became as an author, the more he realized that what he couldn't control was copyright. So,
Mhm.
so many of his books then were simply copied and he never received royalties. But he wasn't very good about, and he was very interested in investing. Unlike Victoria, he wasn't good at it, And but he was very good at lecturing. And so he was
That parallel
huge.
really jumped out. Yeah.
Yes, he was hugely popular in Europe, but he was amusing and he was very good about, establishing and maintaining his brand all the way through his adult life, and there were images of him and so he was quite clever that way. But yeah, no, I think that I'm sure he was aware of Victoria, most especially since they both lived in London at one point. But
I
I
think
don't,
the Beecher Tilton affair, probably he was aware of
yes,
that as
oh,
well. Yeah.
absolutely. But I don't know. And I'm convinced that he must have admired her in some way because he recognized in her something, unqualified in terms of being an American.
So I was trying to find it before we started, and my coworker who told me this today, I didn't have a chance to look it up, but that we had some note somewhere that he wouldn't let his wife go see her speak. And he actually, there are other women on the lecture circuit where he finds them distasteful. Like, I think he
Yeah,
struggles with
yeah.
this. But the fact that both of these people essentially are able to use the lecture circuit to
Yes,
pull
yes.
themselves up
Yeah,
out of
yeah,
all this.
yeah.
All that being said, I'm going to ask one more question before we do Q&A. The
Mhm.
number of absolutely bonkers side characters that there are in her life is amazing. So I want to ask you, of all the sort of minor, quote unquote, minor characters in this,
Mhm.
who would you most want to know more about, even if there you know that there aren't any more sources? Like whose life in this book do you think I need
Question.
to know more?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, what I'm quite honestly, what intrigues me is are the people who we all know, people like Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, she just slapped on her
Yeah.
presidential. I mean, just she didn't
Yep.
ask him, she didn't know him, she just, decided he would be a running mate. What their reaction was. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't know, I mean, quite honestly, it's she arrived in London and decided to become respectable. And this is what I mentioned in a fleeting moment, that she was completely broke. And what happened was also unbelievable, in that the Vanderbilt family decided that she might blackmail them. And
Mhm.
he was on his deathbed, and they didn't want to have any issue with his will. And so they paid her and Tenny $200,000, which was a great deal of money, then, to leave the country with a pledge of never returning.
I might take that
Oh my
now,
God, are you
frankly.
right? And she was, she took first class cabins, and she probably was on a Vanderbilt steamship,
Yeah.
out to Southampton, Great Britain. Anyway, she arrived, and this is, I think, I mean, this is the most remarkable, as speaking as a woman, what amazes me is that she was 40 by the time she landed. She was determined to marry a wealthy Englishman
Yeah.
from a very respected family. She zeroed in on this very dashing man, considerably her junior, by the name of John Martin, who was the fifth generation from Martin banking family, which was older than the Bank of England. He was dashing, he was educated, he went to Oxford, he was available, and and she just decided she was going to get to the altar with him. And his mother, just told him, over my dead body, and said, you need to leave go to Europe and put some distance between yourself and this woman. And what happened to Victoria was she just kind of shifted tactics, and she started to write to him on a daily basis as if they were already married.
Yeah.
And then she bought an engagement ring for herself. So, I mean, what interests me, not so much because these were not obscure people, but how she managed to impact some of these people, and how she got what she wanted or needed.
Mhm.
That is what, I continue to wonder about it, because she was, it was all remarkable.
Yeah. You note at one point she, Tenny, and then another sister all end up married to three of the wealthiest men in the UK.
Oh, yeah, no, no, they
It's
were, and there is something appealing about American women, actually, to, in terms among English men. I don't know whether they are wildly popular among the women, but what is admired and appreciated is the freshness and the directness and the energy. And so whether it's Nancy Astor, I mean, there's a whole, chorus line, so to speak, of
Mhm.
American women who did extremely well. And it obviously includes Victoria, who, by the way, her husband predeceased her, even though he was quite a bit younger. And it happened that his father died only a week or so before he did. And so there she was on the receiving end of this massive inheritance. And she finally decided, well, that's enough. I mean, she didn't need any more wealth. And she was moved to the countryside and died at the age of 88. And,
Yeah.
there you have it. Survived everybody else. She outlived everyone else, including, the Sir Charles Russell, who was the barrister who, tried to dislodge her in court, off her position of libel, and everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, it is remarkable given the life that many of these people lead,
Mhm.
how long they survived, that her parents managed to follow her to the UK after her mother has been at periods of time like pawning her goods out of her house
No,
when
no,
she's on
no.
the road.
The parents were beyond reprehensible.
Yeah.
But and they just stuck to her like a limpet whenever she
But then
went.
she would
Was
return her child to
No,
them,
I
you know.
know, I know. They were, well, it was a collaborative, arrangement, I guess. So yeah, so they were kind of, babysitters in waiting.
Yeah. But
But the mother was, she was real, she wasn't particularly maternal, and the father was, exploitative. But, in order to become respectable in the hopes of becoming, Victoria just absolutely remade her, a family tree. And they never had a family tree. It was more like a, frankly, a shrub.
yeah.
She insisted that her father was, that his father was related to the King of Scotland. I
Mhm.
don't think there was even a King of Scotland, that her mother came from German royalty. So she was, she just was, she was unstoppable.
Mhm.
And the one thing, and I don't mean to make light of her at all, because she was important and she accomplished, she saw, a future 50 years before, things began to unfold, that she was promoting in terms of advancing everything, whether
Mhm.
it was women's suffragette, labor, labor law, um, sexual freedom. She was, a one-off.
Yeah. So one person asked something in the Q&A, asked, did she ever marry John Martin? Yes. And we
Yeah,
totally skipped over poor James Blood,
yeah,
the
no, no.
middle husband,
Well, no, that was the second.
the second.
She plowed through a couple of husbands, in a time when you weren't supposed to get divorced.
Yeah.
But so the first one, he was hopeless, and she lived separately from him. But then he showed up on her doorstep in New York, and she took him in, to her credit.
Mhm.
But he, was a mess, and eventually died from any number of ailments that were related to his alcoholism and his drug. And then she's was absolutely infatuated by James Blood, who she met in San Francisco, St. Louis. He was also a spiritualist. He had come back from the Civil War wounded. He sought her out. She would go from city to city and offer her services as, not in mesmerism, but in a kind of spiritual healing, because mesmerism was hands-on healing that also was popular during, after the Civil War, and spiritualism featured that as a component to the larger equation. And he was also, she liked the good-looking guys.
Yes.
And the idea that he would leave, he was the auditor of St. Louis. He was
Yeah.
respected. He
Yeah.
had a very good, position. He had a wife, he had a family, he had a house, and he picked up and left with her.
Yeah.
And he was hugely supportive. He was a different kind of man, in a period of time when men didn't usually do that. But he was very comfortable being supportive of her. And she eventually decided that, he had served his purpose.
Yeah.
That was, and that was that. And she had a
Yeah.
couple of lovers, but no, she was, she did behave like a man, absolutely, in
Yeah.
that way, in
So
in
some
in many
a-
ways, actually.
and several people have asked, and I think this is a couple related questions here, about what happened to her son, to Byron, and sort of
Mm,
descendants. I did
mhm.
love that, when she goes to the UK, she's like, I'm gonna change my last name to make it
Yes, she did.
Woodhull so that
Yeah.
people maybe confuse me with somebody else. And then her daughter Zulu, she's like, I'll just change her name too.
Oh, no, she would do anything, right? She never asked permission, by the way.
Yeah.
So the poor boy never,
Yeah.
was never able to, speak or dress himself, and she did, make sure that he was taken care of. And he died, I think he must have, it was very difficult to find out what actually happened to him. But the family, I had access to the family archive, and I spoke to some of the descendants, and
Mhm.
they think that in fact the boy, who became obviously a young man and then moved into kind of almost middle aged, died in a kind of care home,
Hmm.
not far from, the country estate in which he lived. The daughter, unsurprisingly, never got over her mother. Her mother, Victoria, was very controlling of the daughter, and made very clear to her that um, there would be a quid pro quo, that if she never married and she was always Victoria's companion and took care of, the kind of admin aspect of it, that she would inherit everything. And I think that her daughter, seemed to be didn't seem to resent that, and that was the arrangement they had. But it's she wasn't very she was her own person, and I wouldn't call her she wasn't enamored by motherhood.
Yeah, it was interesting sort of looking at the generational ideas of family in this space.
Mhm.
And Kathleen asks a question here in the Q&A, which kind of gets to something that I was interested in as well. So she's asking about um, Victoria's description of her father as a con man,
Yes.
and kind of what is direct kind of court testimony in that. And I guess related to that, my larger question about for somebody where so many of the sources are public and the public creation of her is a huge part of this,
Mhm.
what kind of private versus public versus, you know, self-authored versus government sources were you able to use in constructing this life?
Right. Well, that was the challenge.
Yeah.
You and I discussed that
Yeah.
in the, before your audience was invited in. That was the challenge for me. I read everything. I mean, if you look in the back of the book, you will see chapter by chapter what I plowed through willingly and gladly to understand, as much as I could about her as a person. And so the challenge for me was that there was a part of her that was a self-invention. She was very comfortable moving from truth to untruths. And in the constant effort to promote herself, she would, there was no shortage of pamphlets that she had written about her. She engaged a lover to do a biography, and they were all, reality enhanced. And she was, for example, with her her biography, when she enlisted one of her lovers, um, he came, he showed her the kind of first draft, and she said, no, you have to punch it up a little bit. And use, you have to refer more to my incidences, in spiritualism, because she understood at the time that was a hugely important voting block. So, she was always very, very clever about what she needed and what she wanted. And inevitably, she got what she wanted. Um, but it's hard to know what she thought of herself, or not. I mean, I don't think she had any regrets. She was just this huge, hugely, kind of otherworldly creature that was very forceful and just plowed ahead.
Yeah, it almost seemed like, and this is I think a thing those of us who work with Twain all the time, at a certain point, she didn't have a, she was Victoria Woodhull by name in public and private, but you craft a fiction about yourself at a certain point, does it become difficult to actually know or to separate yourself
Yes,
from
you're
the
absolutely
invention?
right. I think that that's exactly right. I think what happens is that the truths that you espouse, that that become, in fact, your reality.
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, you're far more in tune than I am, but I've always admired Twain for all the obvious reasons. Who couldn't? And you do get a sense of his humanity. You understand him from a young boy to, to his travel to first Nevada, when he wrote the short story that put him on the map. He then went to San Francisco and became, even a better known journalist through his books. And his writing especially is wonderfully, it's a wonderful kind of human outreach. Um, she, not so much with her. It was very difficult. She's rather, you know, she's rather remote. She can she declares herself in terms of what she believes should happen, but never was there any self-reflection, or I certainly couldn't find it. I read my way her, my way through her journals and her speeches, and they were all kind of agenda based.
Hmm. Yeah, that there's no, we go back and forth between what does Sam say publicly, what does he say
Yes,
privately, and you
yes.
mentioned Innocents Abroad, one of our favorite, quote, favorite things. Everyone knows travel is fatal to prejudice.
Mm,
But in a private letter to one of his closest friends, he mentions the line and says it's a great line and it gets applause. But
mhm.
anyone who's read the book knows it's not true about me. So
Yeah,
we have that sort of ability to
yes,
go between the public and private persona. And,
yes,
I got the sense that, she's so crafty in these court responses
yes.
anyway. Like they think they're going to be able to roll her and
Yeah.
she
Oh,
rolls
no, she
them.
was one step ahead of them. And of course, she had the great advantage of the fact that they inevitably underestimated
Underestimate her.
every sense of the word. She was a woman, she was uneducated, she was a certain age, she had no background, and she just eviscerated them. You know?
Yeah, that they really, and particularly in the UK, didn't seem to realize what was going
Yeah,
to.
what was heading their way. And they,
Yeah.
so yeah, no, I mean, I read all of the court, the transcripts, which,
Hmm.
very poignant. I mean, the idea that they're writing in beautiful cursive blue ink and, with putting down absolutely everything. So I saw this kind of volley back and forth, and she did not blink.
Hmm.
She didn't blink. She was totally unafraid.
And very clear that she knows exactly what they are trying to get out of her
Yes,
with
yes.
every question.
Yeah, and what she needs to do in order to, to move herself from A to B.
Hmm.
That is absolutely true with everything she did. And she, you're right, she couldn't have done that on her own. She had to engage, this, no matter what she was doing, whether it was
Hmm.
politics or journalism or finance, she always engaged a kind of, a coterie of men.
But she managed to do it every
Yeah,
time.
yeah, no, no, absolutely. No,
It was
she was,
amazing.
at any rate, no, was, and to this day, with me, remains remarkable.
Yeah. Just so many fascinating stories and things where the the brazenness in the best way that she was daring someone to call her out on these things so often was really wonderful. So there's so many fascinating stories in here, so many amazing characters. Tenny herself
Mhm.
deserves, well, I don't know what she deserves. She did some very challenging things. But
No, well, she enjoyed herself. I think she enjoyed herself far more than her sister did.
yeah, she sure
She
seemed to.
just,
So,
and she never tried to be anything other than who she was,
yeah.
which, ironically was hugely appealing to her, to her very wealthy husband, who she, and she didn't zero in on him, but
Yeah.
she happened to cross his path, and he was one of the wealthiest men in the UK. But so that but she had a very different personality.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
Victoria was the one who was so applied.
Yeah. So, well, thank you. This has been the number of wild stories I have shared with my coworkers out of this.
You know? Well, it's kind of falls into the Ripley's Believe It or Not category.
Hmm. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eden and Aaron. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank
I want to encourage the folks in our audience to please purchase Eden's book. You can do so through our store. You can come in if you want, if you're close by, or you can buy it through our online store. I put a couple links in the chat. Yeah, I also want to say please join us again. We're going to have a lot of things this September. I particularly want to highlight two things. On September 18th, I'll be moderating a program, which I don't do very often, but it's for a book called Dandy. And it's about the history of menswear and men's fashion through the 19th and 20th centuries. That should be a really cool conversation. And Erin is going to be moderating a program the next day in person um, about AI and writing. That's correct, right, Erin?
Yeah, it's actually hybrid. So we'll be doing it in person at the
Oh,
museum, but
yes,
it'll
I
also be
forgot
live
that.
streamed. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, so please join us for an event in the near future. Remember, it's free for members. So if you get a membership, it'll be free for you. So wonderful. Thank you for joining us this evening and have a great night.